I wasn't going to say this, but I have a son who is going to be a third-year law student here at CU Boulder, too. We aren't paying for that one. At any rate, I'm so pleased to be here tonight, although I feel like a fish out of water in a way from English, but nevertheless, I'll do my best here. I have a few statistics about DU before I introduce Dr. Padgett, so just briefly bear with me. If you don't know where DU is, University of Denver, it's down the road about 45 miles, and when I used to come here many years ago, it took me exactly half as long as it takes now with that highway congealed as it is. But at any rate, the University of Denver is ranked in the top 100 national universities in the United States, and the Division of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, a tongue twister, AHSS for short, engages in projects as diverse as our 15 departments and schools, from studio art and music to a newly formed emergent digital practices, to sociology, psychology, and political science, where your host, Seth Maskett, will soon assume the chairmanship, which you're looking forward to, I know, political science. We're also home right now to a new postdoctoral cohort of 7 faculty from 7 different departments, all of whom are united under the common theme of migrations and diasporas. Kind of an unusual, I think, thing for our university and for universities in the U.S. The territory of our inquiry and expertise is vast, yet a common goal binds our 220 faculty and 2,250 students together: our passion for the complex ways in which we humans express ourselves, organize in groups, and seek understanding. Now to Dr. Padgett. Dr. Padgett's career path certainly expresses a consistent passion for this same common goal. He is currently a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, with associate memberships in the departments of history and sociology. He has held a variety of professorial appointments at Italian universities, including universities of Trento, Bologna, Bocconi University in Milan, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Lucca. He has been a visiting senior fellow and research professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and was, early in his career, an assistant professor of sociology at Harvard University. He has taught an impressive and interdisciplinary cadre of courses at both graduate and undergraduate levels, from a workshop on organizations and state building, to network analysis and social structure, to sociological theory, and to a team-taught course, Renaissance Florence, Social History and Political Theory, which I would like to take at some point. Professor Padgett received his BA from Princeton University and his MA, MPP, and PhD from the University of Michigan in Sociology and Public Policy. He is the recipient of numerous grants, awards, and fellowships from, to name only a few, the National Science Foundation, the Santa Fe Institute, the Hewlett Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. His publications range widely from essays in such diverse journals as Renaissance Quarterly, American Journal of Sociology, Industrial and Corporate Change, and Law and Society Review, to chapters in numerous books, to his current book, The Emergence of Organizations and Markets, co-authored with Walter W. Powell and under contract with Princeton University Press. Dr. Padgett's 20-year project, in his own words, has been the collection of a massive quantitative data set about social network evolution over 200 years, 1300 to 1500, in Renaissance Florence, where he has unearthed and investigated information on roughly 55,000 people, 11,000 marriages, 14,000 loans, 3,000 business partnerships and firms, and 40,000 tax records. As one article on Professor Padgett's achievement notes, Padgett's analysis of 38 prominent Florentine family trees and the marriages of 298 families of lesser renown revealed an abrupt shift at the start of the Renaissance. He maintains that the shift, combined with other factors, eroded the political influence of elite Florentine families. At the same time, the previously excluded middle class united behind one family, the Medici. As an English professor, although albeit one with a strong side interest in art and the history of the Florentine Renaissance, I admittedly had to struggle to understand Professor Padgett's discussion in the introduction to his new book of the biochemical model of autocatalysis. I hope that's how you pronounce it. Okay. As it applies to organizations and social network analysis, and as it offers a processual view of social structure. However, on page 16, I was abruptly struck by his preliminary discussion of this process, as though he realized the need to translate for humanists like myself, who can be desperately ignorant of scientific disciplines. Seeking to disabuse us of our sense of personal solidity and its consequent isolation, Professor Padgett states, quote, "We are not the coherently bounded objects that we think we are, but a chemical process that renews itself for a while. From the chemical perspective, life itself can be defined as an interacting ensemble of chemicals that reproduces itself in the face of turnover of its parts." He goes on to compare this model to the operation of organizations where production and distribution of goods by firms are only half of what is accomplished in markets. Firms are also produced and transformed by the goods and people passing through them. Social structures should be viewed more as vortexes in the flow of social life than as buildings of stone. Perhaps, I thought, turning immediately to one of my favorite literary essays, the 1919 Tradition and the Individual Talent by poet T.S. Eliot. Eliot was predicting a sort of autocatalysis when he wrote about the way a poem fits into a constantly changing body or organization of poetry from all periods. Eliot states, "No poet has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new work of art among them." End quote. To demonstrate this process of how a new poem enters the canon, Eliot employs an analogy of a catalyst, taken from a chemical experiment where two gases are mixed in the presence of a filament of platinum to form sulfurous acid. Professor Padgett's introduction has helped me reread Eliot's old essay in a new light and has allowed me to be less afraid of venturing out toward the scientific world in search of connections. Finally, I am reminded of Dante, an exiled Florentine poet on the cusp of the Renaissance, with one foot still squarely planted in the medieval Christian world, and incidentally a poet whom T.S. Eliot greatly admired. In the Inferno, Dante shows us a truly interdisciplinary mind, able, through the compelling metaphor of a journey with the pagan classical poet Virgil as guide, to thrust us through a complex series of levels of sin to the icy bottom of hell, where the devil sits with the traitors Judas and Brutus. Could we, I began to wonder, apply a social network analysis to Dante's poem? One that would allow us to see the individual compartments where the sinners are variously housed as a vast and constantly changing tapestry, where each new sinner slightly shifts the pattern in what Professor Padgett might, perhaps, term innovation as opposed to invention, if I've understood that correctly, which I may not have. I'm not sure that Dr. Padgett's talk today, The Emergence of Organizations and Markets, will answer that question, but I'm certain we will find, if not answers, at least more questions to raise at the end. Thank you.
And you claimed you didn't understand autocatalysis. Actually, I was obsessed with T.S. Eliot in high school, and maybe that's where I got this idea in the first place, I don't know. Anyway, before I begin, I wanted to start with a note of thanks to Seth and also to David Noak in the background. As you may probably do know, these order of our talks was originally inverted. I was supposed to speak yesterday. He was supposed to speak today. But due to, I don't know, we never got to the bottom of exactly what the problem was, but we had a misunderstanding of when. I was basically in Italy yesterday, so there was no way that I could have done that. So I'm incredibly gracious to Seth for crisis managing, and I'm especially grateful to David. It's a very, very generous gesture to respond to a problem that he didn't create, but he helped solve, and I'm indebted to you, David, and I do want to say thank you. Okay. My talk is basically a survey overview of this book that's coming out in August with Woody Powell with this title. The question is about emergence. The word emergence, the first thing I'll say, means a lot of different things. In this book, the word emergence means speciation, that is the creation of new types of organizations specifically. What is the process of novelty, construction of novelty, new types of organizational forms. The book is basically a dialogue between network theory, network reasoning, and evolutionary theory. You know, it operates, again, on sort of longer time frames of at least decades or hundreds of years. And the basic question that the book is addressed is really the same question that Darwin raised. He called his book The Origin of Species. This book is about the origin of organizational species and the processes that underlie that. You may realize, or may not, that Darwin actually never answered his own question. He, changed the world by constructing a theory of natural selection, but he didn't really tell us anything about the origin of species. Birds can get long beaks or short, but he didn't tell us how dinosaurs were turned into birds. So that was impossible without genetic research and things that didn't exist in his time. So I'm basically going back to the question that Darwin asked, but I want to ask it from a social network sort of point of view. I want to not just sort of bring existing evolutionary theory into social network analysis. I want to use network reasoning to rethink our understanding of Darwin and evolutionary theory to begin with. And so that basically means taking a relational rather than an atomistic perspective on evolutionary theory, not abolishing social Darwinism, survival of the fittest and so forth, and talk about the evolution of networks and how new organizations are constructed out of those evolution of networks. This may seem radical, but actually this is exactly in parallel to what's happening in biochemistry today. Genetic research is really today all about not just genes as sets of balls, objects, but networks of genes, regulatory networks of genes, molecules, metabolic networks. The evolution of these genetic networks is today considered to be the answer, basically, to the question that Darwin actually raised. And so I'm really doing something very, very parallel to what I think is happening in the physical sciences, and I'm trying to sort of bring that to bear for our type of question. That's the first thing I'll do, which is just to give a sort of a table of contents of the book, and then I won't talk about all of this, of course, but I'll just give you the big picture. There are, as she said, there are 3 chapters on autocatalysis. I'll explain this concept a bit more in a second, but it's basically the core idea that I draw out of the origins of life literature and that I'm bringing to bear on sort of social sort of network applications. 1 chapter that reviews the actual chemistry of the origins of life, 1 chapter that applies this type of modeling in an agent-based simulation framework to economics and economic productions and markets, and then a 3rd chapter which applies this sort of framework to more sort of linguistic and evolution of the family. I have 4 chapters on early capitalism and state formation, medieval chapter on origins of international finance, my favorite Renaissance Florence chapter on partnership systems, chapter on early Netherlands, the sort of emergence of the stock market and joint stock company, chapter on Bismarck, the emergence of Germany, the collection of all of these small cities, small states into sort of Germany. 4 chapters on communist transition, 1 by yours truly and 1 by others. My co-author, Woody Powell, has pretty much taken charge of the last sort of section. Anything that has to do with the modern world, I turn it over to him. I don't really study much about the modern world, but more the earlier time period. So this is a very big time slice from the beginning of, the beginning to sort of contemporary time. But all of these things are unified and are chosen as cases because they all illustrate an empirical or theoretical model of speciation. the emergence. There's always a new type of organizational form that's in the background of all of these cases, and I'm analyzing the evolution and interaction of multiple social networks to try to uncover processes that I see in these cases that sort of lead to this sort of idea. Most of the talk will be on the first section, autocatalysis, to give you the basic theoretical ideas before going into the empirical part. The last 15 minutes or so, I hope to sort of just give a couple of bullets about all these big cases. These cases are all 70, 100 pages long, so I can't go into them, but at least give you a flavor of some of the findings that come out of the sort of empirical cases that illustrate this. So basically, the big picture, social network analysis meets evolution, a little bit of evolutionary theory informing social network analysis, trying to make us more processual, more dynamic in character, but really the main focus is in the other direction. I'm trying to rethink evolutionary theory from a relational point of view and not try to make it a simple mapping of one theory into another, but a conversation in which both parties change in the process. I have here a motivational slide. It's sort of a rhetorical slide with a lot of metaphors and so forth, but I think it's, I found it useful in the past to get people into the right mindset. I say the social sciences, but really the biological sciences to a less extent, but also to them. But let's focus on the social sciences. Have a problem. We have a problem in that at the black hole genesis, there's really not much discussion in our world, I would say, about where things come from, where people come from, where organizations come from, where nations come from. We usually sort of start with the definition of actors, talk about their interaction and relationships, and then derive fantastic theories from the ground up. But there's very little talk about the derivation of the actors, of the nodes in question. It's like having network analysis with the nodes fixed, and you talk about changing things that are happening on the networks, but the nodes themselves are not changed. The question of evolution is a question of the nodes evolving and changing over time. So this is, it's just a question that we don't really ask that much. And partly it's because it's a hard problem, but partly it's because of this particular problem called methodological individualism. Methodological individualism is not all of social sciences, but it's a very prominent part of social sciences, and that, of course, as you know, starts with axioms, statements about individuals, and then derives interactions from the sort of bottom up. Any theory that starts with a set of axioms, of course, can never derive its own axioms. So if you start with axioms and statements about objects called individuals, you're never going to go back and feed the loop. And that's not like I don't have axioms. Every theory has axioms. There's no theory that's not axiom-free. But if you have this particular methodological individualist, the whole question of where actors come from and how they evolve is sort of ruled out for it. So I'm not trying to get rid of that. I'm just trying to augment that by raising this question about the evolutionary question about how actors and organizational actors and others sort of evolve through time. And to make this move, I claim we need a theory of transformational flow, something like chemistry. We need a theory that again, going back to the metaphor that you liked, which I started with, if you think about me, John Padgett, as a methodological individual, I have preferences, I have a budget constraint, I have certain things about me that define who I am, and I can talk about interacting with various people and so forth. But if you want to talk about how I came to be who I am, then we're going back to, you're talking about Mother and Freud and all these whatever features, my teachers. I have a process of biographical evolution that led to where I am, and I can't use methodological individualism to explain that, even though if I just focus on who I am now, that's fine. So it's a question of time scale. I'm going to alter. We need a theory of how people construct each other through time. And the example, the metaphor I used, which has already been cited, is the human body. If you think of myself as a methodological individual, I have boundaries, I have properties and so forth. But if you think of me as chemistry, like a chemist would, and that's what I want you to think of me now, as chemistry. I want you to think of organizations as chemistry, states as chemistry, so forth and so on. There's stuff coming in, and then there's stuff interacting, and there's stuff leaving. I am just a sort of a vortex of chemicals that are interacting through time, and my existence as a physical body is just a reproduction of these chemical reactions through time. This nose, for example, was not here 2 years ago. Your nose was, nobody's nose was here 2 years ago. Why? Because cells die, atoms are flushed, they're always reconstructed. So I want to think of organizations like that, you know, not as fixed objects with clear properties, but as flows, as vortexes of something. We have to fill in what the chemical analogy is, but of something that flow inputs, reproduces itself in chemical interactions and outputs. It's this sort of gestalt that I think is going to be necessary in order to even talk intelligently about this black hole genesis. And the book is basically an effort to try to do that. Origins of life, the only comment I'll make about this point, I'll come back to it, is that, you know, I was struck, I got onto this whole line of thinking, as a matter of fact, at the Santa Fe Institute, when Leo Buss, biologist at Yale, gave a little, you know, sort of the history of life on Earth in 2 minutes or something, one of these flash talks. We were here a little bit later. And the main thing I remember from that talk was that the creationists, in some sense, are right. Namely, the Earth, you know, it sort of congealed out of gases 7.5 or so billion years ago, and the first billion years ago was just bubbling lava and so forth. So it's just settled down to rock and water about 6.5 billion years ago. The earliest fossil on Earth is about 6.1 years ago. You know, it's actually bacterial colonies. It's going to be in the cover of my book, Stromatolites. So in other words, life came into existence almost immediately once the Earth sort of cooled off. And that's the part that creationists are factually right. You know, life was like, boom. You know, it's not like a process of sampling, distribution. It's like immediately there are sort of bacteria. And so, you know, the question is, how are we going to explain that if we're not going to use the God hypothesis? What is the process of explaining this sort of phenomenon? That was a very striking fact that sort of got me going. So this is just metaphorical. It's just intended to establish that we have a problem that we all need to think about, and we have to think more processually, more flow-oriented, and how are we going to do that? Well, these are the actual 3 steps that the theory in the book develops in order to sort of move in this type of direction. There's a theory of autocatalysis, which is a network version of Darwin. I'm going to be spending 4 or 5 slides telling you what that's all about. There's a theory of multiple networks over time and resource and biographical sort of feedback. I'm going to basically argue that you really need to take into account the interaction of multiple networks if you're going to crack this sort of speciation question. A single network alone will never be able to sort of solve the problem. And then finally, there's the network version of Mendel, various ways of mechanisms of organizational sort of genesis that we found in our cases. So this is sort of a simple outline of the book. I'm going to be spending most of the time here, some here, and then I'll just give you some teasers down here. I'm building on the work of Manfred Eigen. Manfred Eigen won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977, some time ago, nothing recent. But he basically came up with a theory and a sort of a lot of empirical research about RNA and other sort of really modern things. And basically he discovered this concept of autocatalysis, which was his answer to why life existed almost immediately on what's the face of the Earth. And basically, just to be simple about it, before I give you the technical definition, you know, you have a bunch of chemicals around, and they're in the tidal pool or wherever they are. And if you just have a normal chemical reaction, you know, chemical A bangs into chemical B, makes a chemical transformation, turns into chemical C, it continues on a chain reaction, and the chain reaction stops. That's not life. That's just chemicals turning from red to blue or something. You know, that's called inorganic chemistry, linear types of chemistry. Living chemistry has cycles in them. There's a cycle, and then they come back, and there's feedback, and then A is connected to B, B is connected to C, C is connected to D, D is connected to A. So you get these positive feedback loops of reinforcement, and so these chemicals build. As long as you keep feeding them, these chemicals build and build and build and build, and build. You know, this is basically the origin of life. The origin of life is the crystallization of these cyclical autocatalytic chemical networks that reproduce themselves as long as they're fed. You know, and so the process of life is how do you stabilize and organize these cyclical sort of feedback loops. And technically, this is again straight out of Manfred Eigen. Autocatalysis the set of nodes and transformations in which nodes are constructed by transformations and nodes. That's very jargony. So just take it and do the chemical version. Autocatalysis is a set of chemicals and chemical reactions in which chemicals are constructed out of chemical reactions among the chemicals in the set. So you have a chemical, it's a whole set with all the chemicals are being reconstructed out of chemical reactions among the other chemicals in the set. That's the chemical definition of life, according to Manfred Eigen, and the crystallization of that is the emergence of life. And so what we're doing is just taking this basic idea, but saying, hey, a lot of other things qualify. We can talk about products. And what's an economy? An economy viewed from an autocatalytic chemical perspective, it's a set of products and production rules, you could say technologies, transforming, steel and rubber into cars. This, a sort of a ecological view. A set of products and production rules in which the products are constructed by production rules among the products in the set. This is a sort of a Leontiev sort of view, of ecological view of constructing, tangibly constructing products in cycles. This is life. Economic markets are life in this definition of the word. But you could go on. You could say, how about people? A set of people and social networks or social relations in which the people are constructed by relations among the people in the set. So we're talking about social network analysis here, but now we're talking about social relationships transforming each of us a little bit, and there's a whole set of social relations that keep transforming each other, and then over time, the set of people, not the set of biological people, but the set of social rules and relationships that existed among us is reproduced through time. This is how firms reproduce themselves through time. Or I even have a chapter where I talk about linguistic autocatalysis, words, a set of words and conversations in which the words are constructed by conversations among the words in the set. So this is sort of a living conversational version of language, not a Chomsky type idea, but the actual words are constructed through conversations which transform words into other words and so forth and so on. So this is a very, very general idea. It comes out of chemistry, but there's nothing really specific about chemistry. Life in any of these forms would satisfy this sort of property. This is a view that's deeply relational. Networks are here seen not as networks of pipes, not as information that flows, but information that is transformed into other information that's flowed, transformed into other information that's flowed, transformed. It's a set of transformed products, transformed words, transformed people. This is what a network is in this sort of a chemistry sort of view of things. Self-reproducing cycles are core, and a corollary of this is, I say, biological repair or even social repair. If you take an autocatalytic set and you take your hand in, you reach out a chunk of that, you throw it in the trash, you've damaged the thing to no end. But if it's autocatalytic, then reactions among the rest of the set will reconstruct and reproduce the set. So this is how your body's injured, it heals itself precisely because it's an autocatalytic set. Reactions among the rest of the system reproduce and reconstruct the system. So repair is very much a corollary of autocatalysis. So this is the basic idea. And so the question then is, what leads to the emergence of such a property, such a powerful property that reproduces itself over time. So what we're going to do is translate a little bit this framework into a social framework, social setting. Our mantra in the book is especially in our conversation with methodological individualists, is this. In the short run, actors make relations. In the long run, relations make actors. In other words, in the short run, where you're not really concerned about the evolution of people or the change in people, you can just take people temporarily as fixed, which I think you normally can in the short term, then you don't need to listen to my talk. You don't need to pay any attention to what I'm saying because, I'm fixed, and if I'm fixed, then my theory doesn't really have a lot to say for it. And so I'm not really questioning in any way the fact that people have purposes and that they make relations. That in the long run, if you increase your time perspective over a biographical length of time, 10, 20, 30 years, or over a social evolutionary point in time, medieval to the Renaissance. You know, when you shift your time perspective to a long-term framework, that's really not going to be sufficient because you know, actors don't stay fixed. The actors in my Renaissance Florence are simply not like you and me, and it's really a completely bad mistake to sort of go into the Renaissance and think they're like you and me. It's just completely wrong, headed to, you know, there's a lot of evolution, and that comes in the long run. So I say take methodological individualism, social constructivism. Let's not make this a question of theology. Let's just make this a question of time scale, you know. In a short-term time scale, one approach is very sensible. In a longer-term time scale, another approach is more. And instead of chemicals, what we're going to have in our model is basically skills. So production rules are skills, you know, the capacity to do certain things. And skills can be production skills. Skills can also be relational skills, how to interact with other people, and so forth. So there's both production and social skills of flow. People carry skills through them as they flow through organization. These skills are modified through learning and so forth. And this is basically sort of what I call the relational construction of people. But on the other hand, if you look at the organizations themselves, University of Chicago, Colorado University, any organization, in fact, we are all just chemicals flowing into this organization, changing each other sort of a little bit, reconstructing the organizational culture, then we leave in a few years. There's a process by which you can see this as organizational catalysis. It's the marginal construction of people as we flow through, but it's the reproduction of the organizational culture as it stands. So it's really this dialectic, this duality that's going to be at the center of what we do. I'm not going to go into it, but there are three types of autocatalysis that we focus on. Production autocatalysis is the economic part, products being transformed into other products, the economy of the system, you might say. Cellular or biographical autocatalysis is the social version of what we're doing, where people are being reconstructed through skills flowing through them. And I have a chapter, not fully developed, but a sketchy chapter on linguistic autocatalysis, where I think this same ideas can sort of be applied over time. I just throw this up here. There's an agent-based simulation framework in the background for those of you who are interested in agent-based sort of modeling. And there's a chapter in this book which applies this. This is basically, you take about a lot of random rules, you throw them into random distributions, you allow a lot of random interaction, basically a bunch of mess, but then you add certain learning and feedback rules, namely if there's successful chain reactions, you reproduce the rules, which are then forgotten. I'm not going to go into the details, but over time, you will find that the systems that are very large systems sort of self-organize into these market-like trading networks, where each of these can be considered a firm. The arrows are the flows of the products. The little numbers that you can't read in the middle are the types of product of skills that they have. Down at the bottom is the number of these skills, which is like firm size distribution. Again, I'll just point you to the paper, but this can all be very much formalized and translated into sort of the crystallization of sort of market structure in terms of trading and economic transformations and so forth. And there's a lot of very specific findings that sort of follow from this. If you're interested in that modeling side, I'd be happy to say more in Q&A. The second part of what I want to say, though, gets to closer to the empirical cases, and that's the question of multiple networks. Autocatalysis alone is the emergence of life, but autocatalysis alone does not lead to speciation. In other words, you get bacteria that come up, but the bacteria don't do anything. They just sort of sit there and reproduce. They don't turn into something sort of more interesting and so forth. To get evolution in the sense of new types of autocatalysis, not just equilibria of old types of autocatalysis, you basically need two autocatalytic systems, which in my terms are going to be two different types of networks that collide, interact, and then tip each other. So you have autocatalytic system number one, autocatalytic system number two. They interact and feedback, and then they might tip and transform themselves into a new type of a system. So multiple networks is not just like a gloss. If you want to do evolutionary theory according to the argument we're making, you simply can't do it within the context of a single network. There has to be multiple networks interaction, would then lead to possibilities of tipping, which is what speciation as opposed to emergence is about. Here's a graph which is I've published elsewhere, which sort of gives a simple idea. It's also a data set of how my Florentine world looks. You know, you can imagine a plane, a market plane here, in which these dots are people, and lines are partnership systems, and dotted lines are trades, or economic types of flows. And so this is a simple cartoon of an economy where we have 1, 2, 3, 4 firms. We have a lot of people who aren't aren't partners in the economy, and these 4 firms are trading amongst each other, fine. But and if you're simply interested in markets and economics, you just look at that, and that's the end of what you do. But if you're, say, a sociologist, you might be interested in something called kinship, not that. And a kinship, though, is a similar thing. You have people, you have certain lines, which are lines of descent, who had babies with whom and who was producing. A circle would be a family, a dotted line in this case would be like a marriage. And you could diagram a kinship data set in exactly the same way. Or if you're interested in political science, politics, you have political alliance sort of connections, that they make deals, not everybody's in the system, and so forth and so on. And my general point, and a person, a single individual, is a dot down here, which is a politician, but he's also a dot up there, it's a father. There's also maybe a dot up there, which is a businessman. So a person in this diagram is not a dot. A person is a composition of 3 dots, and their sort of relationship among all of these various roles. Peoples are compositions of this type of role. This is exactly what my relational database looks like. I collect data on partnerships, I collect data on loans, I collect data on descent, I collect data on marriages. In terms of my 3 types of autocatalysis, production autocatalysis is a self-organization of the dotted line networks. Biographical autocatalysis is the social emergence of solid line networks. And linguistic autocatalysis, names are these sort of circles. Here's a legitimate family that has a name, and here's just a bunch of people that sleep together, reproduce a lot of kids, but they don't have any name. They're just illegitimate types of things. And there's never any circles down here in Florence, because political parties are utterly illegal, utterly completely. Any political party is like an illegitimate sort of operation. So there are never any circles sort of down here. So anyway, what's the point? The point is this. She made a distinction. Organizational invention and organizational innovation. We use the term sort of in the way opposite to Schumpeter, but I think consistent with OED in the dictionary. Basically, organizational innovation to us is any sort of recombination of networks that generates a new organizational form in any one plane. Organizational invention for us is spillover of such a novelty, into the reorganization of the whole network sort of space. So innovation would be the construction of a new widget. Apple constructed a new widget. Innovation would be the reorganization of the whole software industry to sort of organize itself around this the emergence of a new industry is invention. The emergence of a widget is innovation. And there are 2 processes of innovation and processes of spillover into the reorganization of the whole networks in which they're embedded. To go back to this diagram, an example would be, if you were like in trouble as a businessman in Florence or anywhere else, you're thinking, oh man, this is not working out for me. I've got to come up with a new idea about how to construct a new business. A local search approach, which is what I see mostly, almost entirely happening, conversations with people. You might well reach into, well, how do I operate as a father? That might give me, or how do I operate as a husband? That might give me an idea of how to rethink my business. If I'm, and this happened in Florence all the time, think about a dowry. I'm doing a dowry relationship with my wife. And then if I think of partnerships as a dowry, that gives me a different conception. Or what if I think about, this is how I do politics, what if I try to run my firm as a patron-client system? These are basically ideas. That doesn't mean they're going to work, Doesn't mean they're going to go anywhere, I mean, they're going to solve the business or anything like that, but these are basically your search mechanisms for where you come up with new ideas. They're different mappings of relational practices across this space. But they're not random, they're operating within these vertical lines, which are within the channels, within the roadways through which these sort of relational practices type of move. I have a colleague at Santa Fe Institute called Walter Fontana. He had the great phrase, the topology of the possible. You know, yes, there's all these sort of genetic changes and so forth, genetic drift, but it's always structured by, you know, patterns of existing genetic relationships which constrain the way in which innovations can enter the system and then thereby reproduce. So patterns of Granovetter would call this embeddedness, you know, the ways in which politics and marriage are interconnected with each other. These are the roadways, the constraints of the topology of the possible for how possible innovations. This is just flux. This happens all the time. Doesn't mean speciation, doesn't mean anything new is going to happen, but it just there's a structure to the diffusion of new relational practices over time. That's what we're going to talk about in this. So vertical organizational innovation is really vertical moves, and organizational invention, new types of industries, are horizontal moves. So you may come up with a new way of doing dowry business, but the question is, does that diffuse out and change the whole way in which the industry works or not? You know, so organizational invention, or innovation, organizational invention, these are the two processes that we're going to try to sort of uncover in our empirical work. So the last part I want to talk about is examples of this. This is all very well and good, and this is definitely, I think, well, you can decide whether it's interesting or not, but for me, in the event, it's a sort of a new way of thinking about network analysis in a more evolutionary sort of framework. But the question is, the proof is in the pudding. Are there actual cases that we can find that sort of fit this model and actually show the mechanisms through which these innovations are produced through various types of recombinations and mappings among multiple networks that then autocatalyze through this sort of living sort of cycle sort of process. So moves, or I should say moves across domains, which then trigger autocatalysis. So in this diagram, there are 3 autocatalyses. Actually, there are 6 autocatalyses here. There's 3 domains, and then there are 3 types, dotted, solid, circle, 3 types of production, biographical, linguistic autocatalysis in each of these. So this is a set of 6 autocatalytic systems that interact, and the question is, when do they tip into something new that we'll call speciation? So let me just try to end with some, these are basically the findings of those empirical chapters, medieval, Renaissance, and all that sort of thing. We basically find 8 mechanisms. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just what we found. 8 mechanisms of network refolding and network recomposition that led, in these cases, to the invention of something new. We call them transposition and refunctionality, which applies to my partnership system work in Florence, but it also applies to Woody Powell's biotechnology research in Silicon Valley. Incorporation and attachment, I'll give you slides on each of these as I end the talk, but I'll just give you the list first. My medieval case is something called organization anchoring diversity. Woody's done a lot of work on industrial districts, migration and homology, a story about the stock market, conflict displacement and dual inclusion, Germany, purge and mass mobilization, my favorite, robust action, and then business groups. So these are cases. They're all cases of network mappings from one domain to another. There's always politics, there's always economics, sometimes there's religion, sometimes there's military, a variety of planes. The question is how different planes get reconstructed and crystallize themselves into new organizational forms. Here's an example of the first type, transposition refunctionality. We have the economy, we have politics, the invention of a new type of organizational form called a partnership system in this case. I have a 100-page paper in AJS you can look at if you want to see the details, but it's also reproduced in a shorter version in my chapters. Basically, you take some relational practices that were in one domain of the Guild Small Bankers called master-apprentice. You there's a Champy revolt, something about politics. You move them in, you move the small bankers into city council. They become it has a story that has nothing to do with markets, has everything to do with politics, but then that then leads them to sort of shift into a new domain of international trade. You take these small international guys, small domestic bankers, master-apprentice relationship, you move them over to London. They reconstruct the way London business is done on the basis of their old type of thing. I have a metaphor which you may like. I don't know. I'm not a very good comedian, but this is my one effort at comedy, one pretty lousy effort at comedy. But transposition and refunctionality is like a monkey with a banana. I'm a monkey. I love banana. Banana good. Eat banana. I'm sitting here eating banana, but you know. Ants. And they're lousy, so I go back and eat banana, nothing happens. But then I go in and I say I just invented a shovel. It's a lousy shovel, needs improvement, but it's a shovel, you know? It's an object that digs stuff out, and what this is refunctionality. It's not invention in the sense of having an existing goal that you construct something new to do the goal better. No, this is an old object that has not changed, but you've invented a new purpose, a repurposing of the old object. You know, a banana as shovel. This is the mechanism of innovation that is called, I call transposition refunctionality. And Woody, in his biotech case, has a similar story where you start out with a university lab and you filter them through VCs and they turn into biotech companies. They're still basically doing science and so forth, but now they've got all of this new purpose, which is called making money rather than getting grants from the NSF. They're not doing anything different in a university lab than they were doing in a biotech company, but they've got a new purpose that came from being filtered through this other sort of plane called sort of finance. This is the same sort of monkey sort of story, except in biotechnology. And so Woody and I have this book together basically because we saw this same invention mechanism in biotechnology and in the Renaissance. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but basically, incorporation and detachment is my medieval case. It's basically you take a bunch of things that are doing one thing, you bring them into another organization, and you stick them there, and they sort of get, in 10 minutes, okay, they get implanted with the new organizational form. Then the new organization sort of gets tired of them and drop them, and they go out, and they've been transformed by this imprinting that they received in the original, and then they go off and try to survive in a sort of the old world. And the example is Champagne Fair businessmen who had no concept of office, no concept of writing. They just were on horses taking their stuff to Champignon, and they're trading and their medieval sort of fairs. The Catholic Church brings them, folds them into itself, turns them into papal administrators. Why? Because they've got some crusade wars that they're needing to fight, so for state finance reasons, they bring them in. All of a sudden, these new guys get imprinted with the church. They get imprinted with, they write bulls, they have offices, they stay in places and write letters to each other. They have the idea of a corporation in the medieval sense, which is the body of Christ, which means going through time, continuity of an organization that outlasts the people. That's something that's very, very solid in the church, but was nowhere present in the Champignon fairs. And so this concept of a corporation with stability sort of emerges out of this papal imprinting, and then that goes on as other effects on customs and so forth. That's a second mechanism. It's not totally different than the first, but the first is, you take a little idea and it sort of spreads. This one is like ka-chunk. Ka-chunk is like form-fitting, like a big massive organization in the background called the Catholic Church, sort of which does this. This is a second example that we found. A third example is migration and homology. This is the one that lies behind the emergence of the stock market. My analysis is that the organization of the joint stock company and the stock market really had very little to do with economics. It had economic consequences, but its causes were not economic. It was an unintended consequence of the Dutch Revolt, Protestantism, the big explosion of Catholics versus Protestant civil war in Holland and Belgium. Basically, all the Antwerp sort of Protestants fled to because of religious persecution, fled into the north, and they were not absorbed into the existing, pre-existing Netherlands sort of framework. So it's not like incorporation and attachment, because they were not absorbed, but rather they constructed new organizations that were parallel to the old organizations with new types of people in them. So therefore, the joint stock company is a sort of a mirror image, actually, of the city-state in the Netherlands. So the board of directors is very much like the city council. The ownership of stocks is very much like government bonds. Citizens owned the state in the Netherlands. It wasn't like a monarchy or anything. So a lot of the features that you talk about the joint stock company are just mimicking the organizational structure of the political system, but with completely new personnel, which are these very sophisticated Antwerp trading people who had a lot of much larger international connections. They were not so locally oriented. They were very, very sort of global. So very, very different type of people with a lot of very different type of personal networks crunched into this form, which was, so this migration structure led to, plus homology with the old one, led to this sort of new organizational form. And I have a discussion about federalism, that why there's a connection between federalism and the stock market. The fourth example, I'm only going to have 5, so don't worry. The fourth example is Germany. We make this, I do this with a student named Jonathan Ober. We together have done this analysis where we show that Bismarck has a sort of particular style that he operates with over and over and over again. He may be a genius, but he's a genius in the sense that this one style that he has works great in some times, but it works terribly in the other times, and he has no capacity to distinguish when it's going to work and when it doesn't. He just has his approach, and he just does his approach, and sometimes it's great, sometimes it's a disaster. But what's his approach? His approach is conflict displacement. This is a mechanism which is going to lead from Prussia to Germany. The mechanism is the conflict displacement idea is that you start off like an IR, start off with everybody hating everybody, but conflict displacement is where one actor A attacks another actor C, not really with the objective or with the consequence necessarily of conquering C, but with this sort of hidden or side objective, really, which is of splitting the bystanders who are not involved in the dispute. Splits the bystanders. Why? Because he's going to absorb one half of them into this guy. He's going to fragment them. Basically, the construction of Germany. Germany attacks Austria, but he doesn't turn Austria into Germany. Germany splits the northern principalities and takes over the northern. Germany is constructed out of this absorption framework, even though the action was this. So it's states coming out of war, but it's not like the Tilly thing where person A attacks person B and person B is absorbed into that. It's not like that. It's like person A attacks person B and then grabs person C. This is conflict displacement. Bismarck does this in the international plane in the war in Austria, does it on the war in France, both very successfully, but then he turns around and does it against the Catholic Church, big disaster, turns around and does it against the socialists, pretty big disaster. So he does it in all phases of his career, sometimes with success, sometimes with not. Anyway, this is the first example. You do warfare. This is an interaction, really not so much of economic and politics. It's an interaction between international politics and domestic politics. What are the domestic politics consequences of international actions, international sort of war? Bismarck attacks Austria, with the objective of taking over these sort of countries. He does one thing in one end, but he offers, as you Bismarck scholars probably know, universal suffrage down here, thereby sort of splits northern German principalities. In particular, Prussia attacks Austria. There's this the bystanders called the northern German principalities. The princes are up here. The popular people, or just like businessmen, are down here. War is going on here. Universal suffrage is going down here. This thing is split, so the princes go one way, popular goes the other way. Germany, Prussia moves into the northern principalities, takes over not as a conqueror, but as a German nationalist, and institutionalizes that by creating these Reichstag and Bundesrat things. The Bundesrat is the absorption of the princes, the Reichstag is the absorption of the princes, but notice that the princes and the people have been sort of split. And so it's a institutionalized conflict displacement. Conflict displacement is this. Institutionalization is this. This is the emergence of Germany as constituted by these legislatures, which is a sort of a product of this international relations that's going on here. So it's really an interaction of international relations and that sort of thing. The final example I'll give is the communist chapter. I gave this talk last year in Ann Arbor, so I won't go into great detail, but basically I draw a comparison between very, very similar dynamics that happened in the evolution of Russian communism and Chinese communism, in particular the collectivism wave of Stalin in the early 1930s is very, very parallel to the Great Leap Forward under Mao, and then the great purges and murders in 1937 is very, very parallel to the Cultural Revolution under Mao. So one thing is happening a few decades later, but the dynamics are very, very similar to the time periods, the politics, and so forth. Why? Because there is this concept of purge and mass mobilization that sort of develops. Each leader has a very difficult time getting control of his own party system. Why? Because these networks develop within the party system that block him, these family circles in Russia, these vertical factions in China, and these mass dramatic actions are built in to the top, reaching down to the bottom to do war on the center. So this is a dynamic which is underneath of all four of these episodes. But the reason that China and Russia went their different ways is that the structure of these informal networks turned out to be very different in the two cases because they're getting around different formal structures. The horizontal structures that you find under Stalin and the Soviet Union were the reason that Gorbachev never could get anything. He had to escalate into his own purge and mass mobilization called mass democracy, and this is because he never had a personal network that reached down to the bottom that he could sort of build a party through. He had to reach outside in order to sort of blast his own system, a very Stalinist way of doing it. I'm not saying Gorbachev was Stalin, but he had a very Stalinist style in the end of trying to sort of break his own system. Why? Both guys had these horizontal networks that they had a very difficult time reaching. Whereas China is always talking about Guangxi, but that's always vertical networks, these vertical patron sort of networks. And the reason for that is that the structure of China, formal system is everything is state owned, but in China you have this system where big companies are owned by the top, medium-sized company owned at the province level, small size. You have everything's state owned under Mao, but it's decentralized sort of state ownership, and that creates incentive for these vertical factions sort of to develop. So this is basically the idea of Gorbachev. The idea of Khrushchev. Khrushchev had very little impact on the evolution of Russia, I say, but he had an unappreciated impact on the evolution of China because Mao, in the Great Leap Forward, adopted Khrushchev's reform, which was this, which then set up these vertical faction networks and so forth. So it's all, these cases are all different, and I know I'm just sort of blah, 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 blah about all these cases. There's a lot of empirical work behind all of these things, but they're all just meant to show that any of these cases, medieval, Renaissance, early modern, it's all a question of interaction across these multiple levels. You have network level 1, you have network level 2, you have network level 3, and they're different in these cases. But the construction of something new always comes out of some interaction among these networks that then tips in unanticipated sort of directions. I have all these great people, Mao and so forth, but and even Bismarck, I'm not saying people didn't have a big agency, but I am saying that they didn't control what they made. This is all unanticipated consequences and things that got out of control. Even Bismarck did not really control in any way what he made. Stalin did not control sort of what he made. So these are all these sort of massive feedback systems that's underlying the case. So to conclude, where do actors come from? Where does novelty come from? These are the two questions in the book. This is the question of emergence. This is the question of speciation. Actors like Manfred Eigen told us really come out of autocatalytic concatenations of transformation flows, and he basically has the basic idea coming out of chemistry, and then we are applying this to economics and sort of social networks in various ways. We're extending it, though, by adding biological autocatalysis, linguistic autocatalysis. And the second thing about novelty, novelty always comes from interaction among multiple networks, not single networks. And there's two types of vertical novelty, which is happening all the time, and then tipping into invention, which happens very, very rarely in a punctuated equilibrium sort of way. So this is how I basically resolve the, Darwin versus Stephen Jay Gould sort of thing. There's Darwin sort of random innovation happening constantly at this level, but there's Stephen Jay Gould punctuated equilibrium that basically happens at this level, and that's all about the sort of tipping of these overall networks. So at the end of this game, these novelties are not just novelties, they actually reorganize the whole network structure that people are in. Like I said, for most of what we all do in network analysis, you don't need to listen to my talk really, because this is a question of sort of evolution, long-term scale. I think it's just a question about novelty. It's a question about genesis that is simply not on our collective agenda. And I think the main point is, not that this is the answer. Maybe there's a better answer. But we should need to get this question of novelty and emergence onto our collective radar screen, especially if we're talking about longer-term questions, the evolution dynamics, not over a question of a couple of minutes or even a year, but over a question of a decade or a century or something. Evolutionary levels of economic. And I think actually there's a lot that network analysis can contribute to evolution through adding this sort of relational perspective. And again, I can close by saying this is what's happening in biochemistry. That's what I learned at Santa Fe Institute. Nobody talks about changing distributions of alleles anymore. Population genetics is sort of passé. It's really much more about sort of evolution and tipping in these genetic regulatory networks. And basically, I'd like to see us do things, make moves that are very, very parallel to what's going on right now in the biological sciences. Okay, thank you.